I'm Laura Heritage. I'm the Director of API Strategy at SO Software. And thanks for joining me today. We're going to be talking about API description languages and hopefully try to give you a good overview of what they are, why they're useful for an enterprise, and dig a little deeper into a couple of them that I see most often when I go out to customers. So what is an API description language? Well, for my terms, I would consider them, one, to be used as a blueprint. They help you lay out how your API is going to look, basically giving you some ability to do some design and share and collaborate with architects and even your consumer of the API. That being said, they really act as a contract between you and the consumer. Now, if you're thinking about a developer, do they actually have to know how, the details of each of the individual specifications in order to consume your API? No, they don't. It's really there just as a contract and to help with some system integration and help generate code. So that's where I get with the metadata. A lot of these API description tools capture the metadata that is important to actually use the particular APIs and the resources and so forth within the APIs. It is also used by other systems to do system integration. And finally, the fourth aspect of the API description language is that human readable docs that it produces, so that you can easily understand what you're trying to consume. And so with these four characteristics, we'll take a look at the various API description languages in the market today. So what about WSDL 2.0 and WADL? For REST, they're just not widely adopted, and they're a little bit inadequate to really capture the REST capabilities. Both are not human readable. It's not a specification that you would show a non-technical type, right? Somebody that's technical but might not know the ins and outs, and you don't want them to have to understand the details of a WSDL or a WADL document, right? You just can't really, unless you know them, unless you're technical and you can just pick them up and read them, to a deep techie person that understands that, it's not a good way to share and discuss or to devise a blueprint of how you're going to take your roadmap forward. Another aspect is that, from that same vein is that they're typically, the WSDLs and WADLs are typically auto-generated from your code. So you basically lose that, like I said, that whole top-down notion of design and thought. It's auto-generated. WSDLs, another reason why they're not really used is WSDLs, they contain most everything you need, right, to understand about a particular API, REST, or in WSDL 2.0 or SOAP base, but it makes it very brittle. So if you change it, right, if you change that WSDL or WADL document, the clients must change too. Now, WADL, it's different, but it's not like WSDL where it contains almost everything you need to leverage that service. It doesn't contain enough information to accurately describe the RESTful services, and it does have some extension points which you can use, but they're seldom used because it's typically, by the time you're producing a WSDL or a WADL, you're just regenerating it from your code, and you just don't get enough information. Okay, so API description languages really brings rest to the enterprise. Before Swagger came on the scene, before RAML came on the scene, when I asked customers why they weren't adopting REST or what was the barrier for them to adopt REST, a lot of them said because there's really no way to describe the REST, okay? There's no way to really govern it. When Swagger and RAML came on, I saw a huge uptake and a huge acceptance in enterprise of REST, right? And when I query, customers, when I go out to them, I see a lot of enterprise customers around the world. I ask, what do you use? And a lot of them are just investigating, either using Swagger or RAML for that vein. And the reason why API description languages help enterprise adopt REST is because they need to be able to govern a RESTful API. Okay. Now, I know startup people and startup companies are like, "Ooh, we don't want governance," but there needs to be governance in an enterprise. Enterprises are held to a different standard than a startup or a smaller company are. There's more to risk, and there's, just frankly more to manage. If you're using REST or doing APIs within the enterprise, you're not dealing with, 10 or 12 APIs. You're dealing with, some customers have 400 to 500 of these things, and you need to be able to manage and control them. Another thing that for an enterprise that API description languages bring is the ability to share, to make, to be able to share that API description between teams, between systems, and it just makes it a lot easier to actually, make the adoption happen within the enterprise when you have a description language that can describe your API. Third thing that API description languages do for APIs in an enterprise or outside an enterprise is they make it human readable. So again, your consumer of your API doesn't have to be an expert in any one of the description languages. They get human readable docs. They just figure out how do you use this API and they can begin using it. And a lot of the times, the API description languages provide, based on the communities that we'll see, will provide tools to help them to consume, right? So you can create client tools and have them generate off of that API description language. So there are many API description languages available today. We've got everything. We talked about WSDL and WADL, and they're really not contenders, right, in the space, even though they're there. Some companies do use them, but really when I go out, not very many going forward are using WSDL or WADL to describe their RESTful services. You still have to use WSDL to describe your SOAP-based services because none of the API description languages that we see here really support SOAP at all. So those enterprises that are using SOAP, you're still going to have to do your WSDLs. But the other API description languages available today, just go ahead and Google. You're gonna see JSON docs, API blueprint, IO docs. Mistype there. I'm not good at making presentations. RAML, Swagger, and Hypermedia. By far, the three most popular that I've seen and that I've investigated are API blueprint, RAML, and Swagger. And of those three, and I'm going to narrow it down for the rest of the presentation, is focusing on RAML and Swagger because those are the two big, when I query, I was had a meetup a few weeks ago. When I query what the folks in the group are using, it's RAML and Swagger. And I would say it's about 1/3 RAML, 2/3 Swagger at this time. The format of these description languages, API blueprint, is Markdown. RAML, it uses YAML. Swagger uses JSON. All of these are available on GitHub, right? Super easy. If you haven't used GitHub before and this is your first time and you're not even really technical, super easy to do. Both Swagger and RAML do a great job of walking you through downloading it and begin playing with it right away. Very, very slick. API Blueprint is sponsored by APIDLY, I can never say that, RAML by MuleSoft, and Swagger is Reverb. You know, right now the current version, they initially committed them, you know, API Blueprint in April of last year, RAML of September last year, so that's coming up on its birthday. And Swagger, the incumbent, has been around since July 2011. So RAML and Blueprint, I could see another revision of the specification coming out soon. And also Swagger, everybody's waiting for the 2.0 that is about to be released sometime soon. Okay, there are work groups for RAML and Swagger. RAML has a very distinguished group of folks that are on its work group, and Swagger just started up a work group for its 2.0 work, which also has a pretty distinguished group of folks. Now, if you take a look at API Blueprint and RAML, they are top down. So just like I said before, when I started this conversation, there are the 4 characteristics of an API description language. One is a blueprint. Okay, so you can blueprint it before you even begin coding, and that's what top down really means. Okay, and Swagger at this particular time is a bottom up. So you typically do Swagger embedded in your code, in your server. You can do it manually, but as of like right now today, there is not a top-down editor for that. But that is changing, and I'll get to that soon. I think, you know, as we go forward with these API description languages, all of them will eventually use the 4 characteristics I said at the beginning. It'll act as a blueprint, act as a contract, act as metadata for machine-to-machine or system-to-system communication, and also produce the human-readable docs. Those will be the 4 characteristics that all API description languages will eventually do. So how do you choose between all of these API description languages? And Hugh, if you could right now put up a poll. And just like I poll every one of my customers that I go out to talk to, I would like to poll this audience here too. So you'll see over on your lower right hand side a poll question. Which of these API languages do you use? Now if you use more than one, select the one that you use the most, or say that you're evaluating. And we'll give you a few minutes for that, or not a few minutes, a few seconds for that. I'll continue on, and we'll hopefully get the polling question answered and get the results in a few minutes. Okay, after everybody answers. So which one do you choose? I'm going to narrow it down between RAML and Swagger, because those, like I said, are the 2 top main ones that I'm seeing personally in the enterprise. And I mostly speak with enterprise customers, okay? So when I'm asked that, I typically say, well, you need to define the key purpose behind using that API description language. Why are you using it, okay? So for example, one of the reasons that is used is I need the ability to design the API with technically limited API stakeholders. So obviously they have to know some technical, you know, they have to be somewhat technical, but like they might not know they might not know, you know, Node.js or RESTful web services or any of that. They might not even know what you're going to implement it in, right? And maybe you don't even know what you're going to implement this API in first, right? You just first want to get a good design. If you're going that route, if that is your need, if your need is sitting with a bunch of architects and discussing how you want to design, you know, your API structures and so forth, RAML is a good option. It's a very good option to sit down and do some top-down design, right? It has nice tools, very easy to use. Now, that being said, Swagger just a couple months ago put out a beta or demo of a top-down Swagger editor. So they'll eventually get to the place where RAML is today, where you can design completely before you even pick which type of platform you're going to go on. If you're going to use, RESTful Web Services, or you're going to use Node.js, JavaScript, okay? So, that's one reason why you'd possibly choose RAML over Swagger, okay? The next one, okay, I want to describe and design APIs with my technical team. Okay, well, again, you got to ask, well, what does your technical team consist of? If it's a bunch of architects and you want to do a lot of, and you're actually going to be doing some really complex APIs, maybe you're a bank, maybe you're an insurance company, maybe you're modeling non-traditional type APIs that are going to be kind of complex, or you got a lot of APIs that are going to use the same data model, right? And so there's some elements that you can reuse in several different APIs. RAML would be a very good choice because RAML allows for file includes and, has a few more metadata constructs than Swagger would have, okay? They also allow you to do some inheritance and have traits for example, searchability and paging and caching and things like that. RAML is a good source. Now, if your technical team you got a small technical team and you're a bunch of developers and you know that you're going to be using Node.js with Express and you're just, you have a small set of APIs and they're pretty standard, Swagger, very good. Fast, up, ready platform, very good for you, right? Getting you right to the coding really fast, documentation's in your code, you can iterate fast, okay? So if that's your requirement. Now let's say I need to validate the request and response at runtime. So let's, you want to make sure that the request coming in, adheres to your specification and the response going out adheres to your specification. Both Swagger and RAML have this capability, okay? For example, Swagger Node Express and Swagger Play has that capability, and that's been around for quite a while and playing with it. RAML has a very young solution or module in this, and that's Osprey, but that's going to get there too. Remember, Swagger has about 2 years on top, ahead of RAML, and its community has 2 years on top of RAML. But RAML is closing that gap very quickly, and enterprises, because of the 2 previous points I made, are adopting that, okay? The next criteria, okay? Well, maybe I need to easily consume my API specification between 2 or more systems, okay? A good example of this is our SOAP UI friends, right? Let's say you've got testing tools with SOAP UI, you want to test your API, both Swagger and RAML schemas, right, specifications, you load them up and that tool can digest them and your developer or your tester is on their way. So it's a very good, both of them work well in those situations. It's just going to be, how many systems are going to support Swagger, how many systems are going to support RAML or any of the other description languages, okay? Now, again, I need documentation for audit or compliance standpoints. Swagger and RAML, great at both of them are good at that. I need an exceptional external developer experience. Swagger is what everybody thinks of, right? That is the incumbent. That has 2 years ahead of RAML. Now, it's great. It's embedded in a lot of things that we see, a lot of developer portals out there. But RAML has some really nice documentation as well, or starting to, as the community starts, has a lot of lessons learned about, what developers like on an experience, what is needed from an enterprise perspective and from an external developer perspective. So I gave them, I would say it's almost a toss-up between those two if you're actually going to, build your own user experience for your APIs. Now, the next one, I need to generate server code. I want to stub out my server code. Top-down approach, if you're coming from RAML down, you can stub out Node.js and RESTful web services, okay? So you just run your RAML document through it, and it generates the interfaces for you with the proper RESTful web services annotations and some of the Node.js. Swagger is similar. It depends on how you get that Swagger document. That is going to be the issue. If you're going to download somebody else's Swagger document that's already been created, run it through the code gen and get the server and the client doc, whatever you want to do there. But it does have that capability as well. I need to generate client code. I want to make consuming my APIs very easy for my developers. Maybe I have an external developer experience, or maybe I have some very picky lines of businesses that won't adopt it unless something is absolutely perfect. So you want to make sure that it's perfect for them to consume it. You know, Swagger, because it's been out on the market for so long, since 2011, has a lot of options for what languages and client codes it supports. RAML has limited capabilities there. But again, the community is getting started, and it is ramping up. So it won't be long until, you know, these two things, you know, kind of converge, right? Like I said at the beginning, I think all the description languages are going to have to support in some fashion those four characteristics of blueprint, of contract, of metadata, and of documentation. So another thing before you pick your API description language is really understand how your team works, okay? If you design before you code, right now at this particular point, RAML is the one for you, right? This is if you design before you even understand what your implementation is going to be. If you're going to use Java, JavaScript, or whatever you're going to use, RAML is a good option. Swagger, again, we're anticipating the 2.0 specification coming out, plus all of the new tools, the Swagger editor that is also out. And you can see the Swagger editor on a demo of it on the GitHub repository. The next mark is, do you generate documents after you code from your code? Okay, both Swagger and RAML can do this, right? RAML can take a RESTful web service and produce RAML out of it. Both of them, Swagger and RAML, will basically just use the RESTful web service annotation and pull that out. Swagger will allow you to have, it has its own annotations that you can embed in the code and put even more documentation into your code so that you can generate the human readable documentation later. Do you want to embed the docs in your server code? Okay, do you want to mush that all together so you have interactive docs? It's very embedded in your code. You know, Swagger does this, you know, with the Node Express, Swagger Node Express, and Swagger Core allows you to really create Swagger-enabled servers to serve up your documentation. Okay, the next thing you have to look at when you're choosing an API description language is their community. What's going on in their community? Swagger, by far, has the largest community. It's been around since 2012. It's a very solid community, huge developer following. However, RAML is gaining traction, especially in the enterprises, basically due to the richness of the modeling, its API versioning, its nested resources, its inheritance, its file inclusions. All of that top-down approach is starting to drive and ramp up that community, okay? So when we take a look at the community, if you think of, okay, well, what generators does it provide from the specification? To generate documentation from code, Swagger has several of them, several enabled languages to do this with. My thing, I don't know, I was so excited. EIFL. That is the language I learned how to program on. Crazy. I was so excited when I saw an EIFL, EIFL modules and community in there, which was really cool. That really dates me, but that was really fun. RAML is focusing on RESTful web services at this point, but again, I could see that getting more and more as the specification matures. Spec parsers. So this is to be able to have, parse the information, parse the spec, and then, do something cool with it. RAML has a lot of spec parsers available, okay? So again, it's an indication of where it's going to go in the future. The ability to generate API interfaces, right? So both RAML and Swagger have the ability to generate API interfaces. I think RAML has a little lead here because it's from a top-down perspective, and you have an easy way to create the specification to begin with RAML Editor. Generate client code, again, Swagger has several. RAML is still developing. As far as editing tools, Swagger is new. It's a new one. It's 2 months old or so. But again, over time, it should be, the beta I think was based on YAML, but over time, and I'm not sure what the final one is going to be, over time that'll catch up with RAML. RAML has several different editors. They've got the API Designer, they've got the Sublime plugin, and they have Atom for GitHub to highlight the code. I personally used API Designer and the Sublime plugin when I was playing with it, and they both worked really well. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is, I thought, well, I need to compare these two, not just play with their existing code. So I decided, my son came in, it's his birthday, and he was telling me all these things that he wants for his birthday, and I couldn't remember them, right? And I said, well, go to the website and send me links in an email so I can know exactly what he wants, because he wants all these video games with certain levels and so forth. So when I was trying to think of a scenario, I decided, well, I'm going to create a wish list application. Okay, and I'm going to use the platform of Node.js, Express, and Mongo. I'm going to make it very basic. I'm going to have add user, get user, add wish, get all wishes, and then I want to get a wish for a particular user, filter by prices. So by price range and by merchant and so forth. So the thought would be if my son would have went back to his little, iPod Touch, whatever device he wanted to use, and he was browsing Target or Amazon or wherever he was browsing, he could then add and put things onto this wish list. Okay, so what I decided to do is I want to build this application using RAML, and I want to build this application and document it with Swagger. Okay, so a little background about myself before I get into the comparison, so you can understand why I say the things I say and the perspective I'm coming from. Okay, I got a degree in computer science and mathematics, so I am pretty a technical person. I spent 16 years at IBM, so that shows you I'm like a real enterprise gal. I've always worked with enterprises. I've been, in the last 5 months, I moved to SOA Software. I have 14 plus, unfortunately, I'm dating myself here. I grew up on SOAP, I grew up on REST, and SOA and APIs. Okay, so I've lived and breathed this stuff for the last 14 years. Over the years, I've been a developer, I've been an architect, I've been in competitive technical sales, I've been a product manager and evangelist. So I played multiple different roles within the organization. Okay, so I always wherever I moved, I was always on the bleeding edge of technology, very hands-on. Right now, I would consider myself a Sunday developer. I don't get to code as often as I used to, and most of my time, since my technical sales experience, I spend most of my time configuring products, doing scripting, and working with customers and trying to figure out how to change or fix or work with the APIs and services and the processes that they have in place in order to try to get them to a better place. So with that background, I started with RAML. because from an enterprise perspective, we always like to design. I mean, I came from, you know, the whole UML modeling, you know, use case design, all of that type of experience. And so RAML to me was right up my alley. So I started with RAML. Kudos to the RAML work team. It has unbelievably awesome documentation, very easy to get started, okay? I can start from, you know, I can describe my API, my very basic API, super simply, right? Walk through and design it, and then I can add more and more and more to it as the API gets complex, okay? I would say where RAML is really good is that they do have these other metadata constructs, and they do have file inclusions. So if you have a RESTful API, for example, that might have 20 different parameters, or XML or JSON response that is really huge, you can pull that stuff out into a file include, like you can describe the response in a schema, pull that out, and so it really declutters your specifications, so, and it keeps it very human readable. And you can also then use and include that schema. You can take that schema and use it in other, you know, other APIs and so forth. So really nice. And, you know, this RAML documentation takes you from the basic and then can help you take your API to the next level with all the other things like putting traits on it and so forth. Very good documentation. Kudos. The editors, again, I use the API Designer. That's an online one. It's available. I put the URL there. Great to help you understand what elements are required where in a RAML document. Again, you can start super basic. I mean, so basic that you can, you know, it is really, when you're in the basic area of it, describing your API, non-technical people can understand, I think, what you're doing. And then it gets more complex. After a while, I didn't want to be online anymore, and I have my Sublime editor, and I wanted to edit it right there and have it offline. And the Sublime editor is great. It's the only thing the Sublime editor doesn't do right now is really the whole suggestion of the elements that are required. So sometimes if I got confused or wanted to use the next level of advancement, right, the advanced capabilities, I would have to go back to the API Designer. Indentation matters in both tools, though, right? So, and I'm a messy coder. I admit it. I am very messy. I don't pay attention to the indentions, but they are important. So you got to have you have to have some, you know, make sure your indentions. The good thing is with, like I said, RAML, I kept everything of mine in, it's a small API. I kept it all in one file because I found it was easier. I did play with the includes and traits and so forth, but I just thought, you know, if I have to bring it up to talk to you guys and show you guys something, it would be easier in one file than in several different files. And I didn't bother with security, even though RAML and Swagger do both support security. Generating documentation, there's two. So you can take, you can go RAML to HTML, which I did. I had my RAML document, you know, ran the little command, and boom, I had my RAML documentation. Nice, pretty, easy to understand. They have a RAML to HTML with a PHP version, a lot more type of documentation. Very cool. I really liked it. I was impressed with it. So there's, you know, I think RAML has an opportunity here to really take documentation of APIs to the next level. Thoughts on RAML? Great documentation, samples, and tutorials. Kudos to the team. It is a good way to model your APIs. When I was writing, I didn't use any, so RAML does have some code generation, right? So you can go to, you know, RESTful Web Services or JavaScript. I didn't do that. I actually wrote my Node.js using Express, and I had a MongoDB myself. And what I did is I actually found myself going back to my RAML documentation to make sure I stayed with my specification. Again, it's easy to write and understand from a basic UI API perspective. It does become more difficult if you start doing, you know, really crazy includes or traits or becoming more technical. And I think that would fit right up an enterprise's, you know, that the more, you know, the more complex modeling fits right into the enterprise's realm from the enterprise architects and teams that I've talked to recently. So in the community, you know, the tools, again, kudos, very well documented. I played with almost all of them. I used API Designer. I used the RAML Sublime plugin. I used the RAML to HTML. There's a Swagger to RAML, so if you have an existing Swagger document and you want to produce a RAML document, you can do that, push it through, creates it nice. I did try the Osprey and you know, generated some code there. And I did do there's a module called RAML Lang, and that generates some code too. So I did both of them. Okay, so now let's move on to Swagger. I know I'm kind of running out of time here. Swagger community, again, you can get it off of GitHub, Getting Started wiki page. Really great, easy. There's 3 ways to create Swagger docs right now. You can use CodeGen, which is the traditional way of creating Swagger specifications. It basically converts the annotation in your Swagger in your code to the Swagger specification. So if you're using, you know, RESTful web services and those annotations right out of the box, you can run this through it and you'll get, you know, the basic swag documentation. The whole goal is, even with RAML and Swagger, is that, well, if you have, you know, from an enterprise perspective, 450 you know, APIs using RESTful web services today, you don't have to go back and completely modify them to get the code. You can just run this over, but it's just going to be the basic code. Swagger really gives you a lot of additional annotations and features to really make your documentation inside your code wonderful. I'm going to skip over to the third one. The third one is you can write the JSON specification about your API by hand. I did that, but like I said, I'm a messy coder. I don't like to do all of the parentheses and the colons, and you can do it. Looking forward to the Swagger editor. The second thing, the second way, which is the way I did it because it seemed a lot more fun, and it was actually quite easy, is I use the Swagger Node Express, and it basically embedded the Swagger info documentation in my server. So here's the Swagger Node Express. I'm using Sublime. It's really cool. Basically, you can break it down to 3 files, even though you might have more than 3 files. But you have a server file, which is the Node Express server. You have a model file, which describes your resources, like your user and your wish. For me, it was user and wish. And then you have like a route file, which really, you know, determines your data access. And here is one of my, this is the find all by user handle route for me. Basically, for the Swagger documentation, you create the spec, and you can see how I define the spec here, and very straightforward. Once you have that model done, like the model of your resource done, things just click along. I mean, you know, putting in the query parameters is a little bit more time consuming, but it clicks along pretty fast. Then you have your action and you're done. And then when you start your server, you know, I have the Swagger Node Express has the Swagger UI right in it. So you can call and get your Swagger doc, so you can get the actual Swagger documentation if you want, but you also can have this, especially from a testing perspective, this Swagger documentation here, and it's interactive. So as you're building out your API with the Swagger code, you can test it, and if it doesn't work, you can go back, edit, and boom. So it's brilliant. It's really fun. Rapid prototyping, Node.js. Like I said, it was a fun. It was fun playing with it. When you actually take a look at the Swagger documentation, it contains two files. One file is for the resource listing, basically listing all of your APIs that are available and gives a description of them. And then you have your API description, which really gives the detail of each resource listing and so forth. My thoughts on Swagger, it's the most widely used API description language to date. I mean, it has 2 years on, RAML and the other ones in the field, well, except for WSDL and WADL, but we discredited those in the beginning. Working with Swagger Node Express, once you get the hang of it, it went smooth, very fun to see the results. The key, again, is to really model your resources and definitions, and then everything else, and the routes that you want to take, and then everything else falls into place. Definitely not a top-down approach. I ended up using my RAML specification to keep me on track on what I was doing with with my Swagger implementation. But that's, again, that could be just the enterprise person in me, where I need a blueprint, a design, something to keep my thoughts in order and change and iterate. The con I have with this is you're really embedded, actually even with Swagger, embedding it into all your documentation, into your code, is that you're really embedding your documentation in your code, which this code may live forever. If you're an enterprise like a bank or insurance, I've talked to banks and they say, you know what, nothing in a bank ever dies. So nothing is going to die, even though it's really cool. It really keeps everything on, the documentation in sync. It's there. You've got the Swagger Core project, which provides really nice examples on how to build Swagger-enabled servers. Again, relatively easy. You can get going. It's not that difficult. Swagger UI is a really nice tool to help you visualize and test your APIs as you go. If you have complex APIs, Swagger you might have difficulties, because you don't have the constructs. And if you are writing Swagger by hand right now to date, that Swagger doc can get really long, and you can't really do that whole sharing schema thing. But I think it's going to evolve, especially waiting on the 2.0. Again, writing Swagger manually in JSON is not fun, not human readable. Again, waiting for that Swagger editor to become more usable. Okay, so this, as I was going through this, and again, this could be my enterprise experience and process experience from IBM and so forth. But the question really becomes, where do you do your documentation? Okay, documentation. Do you document in the design and generate the interface and documentation from the design perspective? The bonus to this is having your documentation outside your code allows for changes in docs without disturbing production code, allows you for doing NLS translations outside of the production cycle. If the backend changes but the interface is the same, you're okay. So maybe you want to switch from RESTful web services to Node.js. You don't really have to worry about it because your documentation is separate from your implementation. The endpoint changes. The con, well, documentation can and does get out of sync with what is running in production. Okay, I get that, right? The next thing is, okay, well, maybe you document in the code and generate the docs from the code, but then you maintain them separately. Documentation is more like, if you do this, documentation is more likely to stay in sync with what is in production. And, part of the documentation, if you're using RESTful services, is just part the RESTful service annotations. Now, the problem with this is if there's issues with documentation, you might need to edit production code to regenerate the documentation. Again, every time you change the production code, it's depending on your processes and what you're doing and how your company is, that could be a tedious and expensive task, okay, depending on, again, what your processes are. The next one, do you embed the documentation in the server and have the server serve up the docs dynamically? Again, the documentation is, it's more likely to stay in sync because it is embedded. Not necessarily true depending on, depending on what you're doing, how much of your documentation you're doing. Like if you're describing your method in, a string, I'm a terrible speller. You probably saw tons of misspellings throughout this whole presentation because that's just me. Now imagine if I'm your coder, right? And so now you've got your user experience and your documentation out on the web with misspellings and whatnot. And so in order to change that, you got to go and change your production code, okay? So that's a part of a con. Plus, now you're tied to a particular API description implementation running in your production code, right? So you're going to have to pick and embed that description language in your production code. Again, I was going to say, my next point there is if there's errors, production code must change. So you got to decide where to do your documentation and what level of risks you want to do and how you want things to stay in sync. Thoughts on the API description languages we had seen today? All the API description languages are starting to provide similar features and functions. They are going to, they're going to continue to get closer and closer in features and functions. They're all going to look after, to be doing blueprint capabilities. They're going to all be looking to do, manage the contract, have metadata, and provide user readable documentation. Neither specification we focused on today can handle anything other than a RESTful API service. If you want, for an enterprise or for whoever, if you want SOAP-based APIs, WSDL is still the king. The API platform, though, that you choose should be able to support SOAP and REST, okay? One of the things I was talking with John Musser about is neither specification provides for extensions. So, for example, let's say you want to describe how you want this API to be tested or monitored within that description language, and then being able to share that with the different testing tools on the market. That is not capable today. I know we always tried to get that from an IBM perspective, an easy standard to describe that as well from a SOAP and web services days. So it'll be interesting if we actually get to that point here with RESTful APIs or not. Neither specification handles national language. Systems to systems integrations are going to be, today the focus of these API description languages are focusing really on the creation and the consumption. And most of the time the consumption by developers, right? Or consumption by creating clients, right? So that the developers or consumers can use. But I think as we push forward and more tools are available for REST, and as people start putting more solutions together, we're going to see a lot more and more focus on these API description languages to be used from system to system integration, from a SOAP UI perspective, from a monitoring, external monitoring perspective, and so forth. I want to thank Oli Lensmar. He had this presentation that he gave at API Strats in March, I think it was. Great, nice presentation. You might want to take a look at that. That contains some comparisons as well for API Blueprint, RAML, and Swagger. Dan Meyer has a great long blog about API developer tooling, so you will want to take a look at that as well. So I think we have about a few minutes for some questions. And Hugh, I was wondering, did you get the results of the poll? Okay, he's giving me the results of the poll. Okay, I'm going to give him a second. All right, so let me read some of the questions that have come over. I'm going to expand this. Give me a minute. So one question is RAML and Swagger, machine readable versus human readable. I wouldn't necessarily say that because both of them could be, both can be machine readable, and both of them can be human readable. When you actually create the actual specification from Swagger, with a JSON, I don't think it's very human readable, but when you look at it through the Swagger UI, it's very readable. Okay, it's just not from a top-down perspective. I would say RAML from a top-down perspective, as you're designing the specification, right, designing the API, that specification is more human readable, right? I think you can visually see it a lot easier, what your resources are, what the parameters are, and so forth. But that also can be human, that also can be machine readable too. Now, I want to caveat that RAML bit, right? Because if you stick with the basic constructs, right, and you don't use any traits or inheritance or any of that type of detailed metadata constructs, I think RAML is very human readable. Once you start adding those other constructs in, it gets a little bit more difficult because you gotta kind of know the construct. So it kind of loses a little bit. And as far as human readable, I mean human readable by someone that isn't technical, like super technical, that doesn't understand inheritance, that doesn't understand some traits. That's the same for me. The next one, let me see. So one of the questions is which of these two API description languages will you support in your community manager? I would say we currently support Swagger today. We are working on RAML. I think, from the pollings that we've done from the enterprise, I think you're going to have to, any API management solution is going to have to be able to support both and support WSDL as well. And possibly WADL, because it's just so varied. Okay, so I've got, here's the results from the poll. The results from the poll is 17% of you are evaluating API description languages, 14% of you, and this is out of 231 participants, just so you get the number. So 17% are evaluating, 14% don't use an API description language, 1% is using API Blueprint, 3% are using RAML, 9% are using Swagger. Hey, I am like good at gauging percentage of use between RAML and Swagger. I tell you, I'm from my experience. That's about what I thought it was going to be. 4% are using WADL, 15% are using WSDL, and 38% didn't respond. Okay. Okay, so I think we're running out of time. We ran out of time. I'm going to take a copy of all of the, we got like, huge number of questions. I'm going to take a copy of the questions from the chat script, and I will answer these questions this week in a blog on our site. And if you have any further questions that you want, feel free to either find me on Twitter. You can send emails to me. This presentation or webinar is recorded, and it'll be ready for playback in a few days. And we'll have the slides available for you to download as well. Again, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @HeritageLaura. And then if you want, I can give you my email address, or my email address is laura.heritage@soa.com. So very easy. Thanks again, guys. I hope it was useful, and hope to see you around. Bye-bye.